You're at a party. Someone hands you a drink. You don't think about it. You just drink it. Somewhere between the first sip and the second, your brain releases a small wave of dopamine, your shoulders drop half an inch, and a conversation that felt awkward 30 seconds ago suddenly feels fine. This has been happening to humans for so long that your body doesn't even question it anymore. But here's the part nobody really sits with. Alcohol is a poison. Not metaphorically, literally. Ethanol is toxic to human cells in anything but small doses, and yet it is, without exaggeration, the most widely used recreational drug on the planet, and has been for longer than writing has existed. So the question isn't really, when did humans start drinking? The question is, why a species that evolved to avoid poison spent thousands of generations learning to seek this one out on purpose? And the answer starts somewhere you wouldn't expect. Not in a cup, not in a cellar, in the dirt, underneath a tree, in fruit nobody was even trying to ferment. Let's go back further than most people assume. Long before Homo sapiens existed, before agriculture, before pottery, before fire was even fully mastered, there was rotting fruit. Fruit that falls from a tree and sits on the ground doesn't just sit there quietly. Wild yeast, which is everywhere in the natural environment, starts breaking down the sugars inside it. That process is fermentation, and one of its byproducts is ethanol. This means alcohol, in small natural concentrations, has existed in the environment for millions of years, long before any animal with a brain was around to appreciate it. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2000, biologist Robert Dudley proposed something now known as the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument was that primates, including our direct ancestors, evolved a strong attraction to the smell of ethanol because it was a reliable signal of ripe, calorie-dense, sugar-rich fruit. An animal that could detect fermenting fruit from a distance had an advantage: more calories, more consistently, in an unpredictable forest environment. Detecting alcohol wasn't about getting drunk, it was about not starving. And there's real biology backing this up. Humans carry a specific genetic mutation in an enzyme called ADH4, alcohol dehydrogenase, that appeared roughly 10 million years ago in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. This mutation made that enzyme 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol than the version found in other primates. 40 times. That's not a small tweak. That's evolution installing an entire upgrade specifically for processing alcohol, millions of years before anyone was fermenting anything on purpose. Our bodies were pre-adapted to alcohol before we ever chose to drink it. So somewhere, deep in our evolutionary past, an ancestor who was very good at smelling and tolerating fermented fruit was also an ancestor who was very good at not starving. And that ancestor passed those genes forward. You are, in a very real sense, descended from a long line of primates who were unusually good at handling rotting fruit. That's not a flattering sentence, but it's an accurate one. Now fast forward. Actual Homo sapiens, fully modern humans, show up roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, alcohol wasn't something anyone made. It was something you found. Overripe fruit on the forest floor, naturally fermenting sap, honey that had been sitting in water long enough to turn. These were accidental, low-alcohol, unreliable sources. You couldn't count on them. You couldn't store them. You just occasionally stumbled into a happy accident, ate some, and felt something shift. The moment this changes, the moment humans go from finding alcohol to making it, is one of the most significant turning points in the entire story. And it's older than almost anyone expects. In 2004, archaeologist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania analyzed pottery jars from a site called Jiahu in China, dating to around 7000 BCE. Chemical residue analysis found traces of a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. 9,000 years ago, people were deliberately combining ingredients in specific ratios in vessels built for the purpose to produce alcohol. This wasn't an accident anymore. This was a recipe. And Jiahu isn't alone. In Georgia, in the South Caucasus, archaeologists found grape residue in pottery dating to roughly 6000 BCE, some of the earliest confirmed evidence of deliberate winemaking anywhere on Earth. In the Zagros Mountains of Iran, jars from around 5400 BCE tested positive for tartaric acid, a strong marker of wine. 3 different regions, 3 different ingredients, rice, grapes, whatever was locally available, all arriving at the same idea, independently, within a few thousand years of each other. When that kind of pattern shows up across unconnected populations, it's usually a sign that something upstream of all of them had changed. And something had: agriculture. Once humans started farming, they had two things they'd never reliably had before: surplus and containers. You can't ferment what you don't have extra of, and you can't store fermenting liquid without something to hold it in. Farming produced grain surpluses. Pottery gave people vessels that could seal in the process. Put those two inventions next to each other, and fermentation stops being a rare accident and starts being a repeatable technology. This is where a genuinely strange academic argument comes in, one that's been debated for decades. Some researchers, including archaeologist Patrick McGovern, have proposed something bordering on provocative: that the desire to produce alcohol may have been one of the reasons humans domesticated grain in the first place. Not bread, beer. The traditional story is that humans farmed wheat and barley to make bread, and beer came later as a byproduct. McGovern's argument flips that. He points out that early beer would have provided more usable nutrients more reliably than early bread, which from primitive grain would have been dense, hard to digest, and honestly not very good. Beer, on the other hand, delivers calories, B vitamins, and a mild psychoactive reward, all from the same grain. Whether beer came before bread or alongside it is still argued over conference tables, but the fact that it's even a real debate tells you something. Alcohol wasn't a side effect of civilization. It might have been one of its founding technologies. Let's sit inside an actual moment, because the abstract version doesn't quite land the way the specific one does. Imagine a small settlement near the Zagros Mountains, roughly 5,400 BCE. Someone has stored crushed grapes in a clay jar, sealed with resin, tucked into a cool corner of a mud brick storeroom. Weeks pass. Nobody's watching it closely. When the jar is finally opened, the smell alone would have told them something had changed. Sharper, stranger. Not spoiled exactly, but different in a way that older instincts might have flagged as dangerous. Someone tries it anyway, and whatever discomfort came with that decision, it was outweighed by what happened next. Warmth, loosening, a shift in the room, and crucially, nobody died. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the next batch got made on purpose. Once alcohol became something you could make instead of something you had to find, it stopped being just a nutritional bonus and started becoming something else entirely: a social tool. Here's a pattern that shows up across nearly every early civilization with any written or archaeological record. Alcohol consistently appears in contexts of ritual, religion, and group bonding, long before it appears in contexts of casual, private consumption. Ancient Sumerian texts, some of the oldest writing in existence, include hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, essentially a recipe written as a prayer. Ancient Egyptian workers building the pyramids were partially paid in beer, roughly 4 to 5 liters a day, not as a luxury, but as a basic component of caloric intake and very likely morale. Ancient Chinese ritual bronze vessels, some of the most elaborate objects to survive from the Shang dynasty, were built specifically for serving wine during ceremonies honoring ancestors. None of this reads like recreational drinking in the modern sense. It reads like infrastructure. Alcohol was showing up at exactly the moments humans needed to bond groups together, mark significant occasions, and create shared experience. This lines up with something researchers call the social lubrication hypothesis. In small doses, alcohol lowers social inhibition, reduces anxiety around unfamiliar people, and makes cooperative behavior easier. In a species that survived through group cohesion, anything that reliably increased trust and lowered social friction had genuine value. A shared drink wasn't just pleasant. It may have functioned as an actual tool for building the kind of group trust early human societies depended on to survive. There's a specific piece of anthropology here worth sitting with. Research on modern hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies has found that where fermented beverages exist, they are almost always consumed communally, not alone, and almost always tied to specific social functions: sealing agreements, celebrating harvests, marking transitions like birth or death. The solitary drinker, quietly working through a bottle alone in a room, is a remarkably modern figure. For most of human history, alcohol didn't exist without a group around it. Now here's the part of the story that gets uncomfortable, because it has to. Something that starts as a rare, communal, ritual substance does not stay that way forever, and the transition from that to what we deal with today follows a very specific historical shape. For thousands of years, alcohol production was slow, small-scale, and limited by the same constraints as everything else: hand fermentation, natural yeast, whatever surplus grain or fruit a household or village had. Then technology intervened. Distillation, developed and refined across the Islamic world and medieval Europe roughly 1,000 years ago, allowed people to concentrate alcohol far beyond what natural fermentation alone could produce. Beer sits at around 4 to 6% alcohol. Distilled spirits can exceed 40. That's not a small increase. That's an entirely different substance wearing the same name. Then came industrialization, mass production, refrigeration, global shipping. By the 20th century, alcohol had gone from something a village produced collectively for shared ritual use to something manufactured at enormous scale, marketed aggressively, and available essentially anywhere, at any hour, disconnected from any of the communal or ceremonial context that shaped it for most of its existence. The World Health Organization currently estimates that alcohol contributes to roughly 3 million deaths globally every year. That number exists because the ancient relationship, rare, social, ritualized, got replaced by something cheap, constant, and often solitary. This is the same pattern the last video on this channel traced with smoking. A behavior that starts as something rare and communal, wrapped in ritual and social meaning, gets industrialized, stripped of context, and turned into a product engineered for volume rather than meaning. Alcohol didn't get more dangerous because the chemistry changed. Ethanol is ethanol. It got more dangerous because the container around it, the ritual, the scarcity, the social structure, disappeared, and all that was left was the drug. So when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? The honest answer stretches further back than drinking itself. It starts with a primate ancestor 10 million years ago who got better at metabolizing rotting fruit and passed that advantage down the line to you. It continues with early Homo sapiens stumbling onto fermented honey and overripe fruit for hundreds of thousands of years, taking what the environment occasionally offered. It becomes deliberate around 9,000 years ago in a Chinese village, in Georgian vineyards, in the mountains of Iran, when surplus grain and sealed pottery turned an accident into a recipe. And for most of the thousands of years since, it stayed exactly what it started as: rare, shared, meaningful, tied to gods, to ancestors, to the moments that mattered most to the people living through them. You are the current endpoint of that whole chain. The dopamine response, the loosened shoulders, the easier conversation, none of that is new. Your body has been running that same program for millions of years, long before anyone wrote it down. What changed isn't the chemistry, it's the context around it. Your ancestors earned that response rarely and shared it deliberately. You can get it in under a minute, alone, any night of the week. The craving is exactly as old as it's always been. The scarcity that used to shape it is gone. If this is the kind of thing your brain finds genuinely interesting, the gap between the instincts we're still running and the world we actually built them for, that's what this channel is for. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging into it every week.